For our next speaker, we have Josh Ostrander from, also researcher here at IDA. He's also in the Sustainment group, and so he will be speaking about packing for a road trip, provisioning deployed units for a contested logistics environment. You get 5 minutes.
All right, thank you so much. So it's a happy convenience that I'm going right after Connor and Jasmine, because I think you'll see a lot of common themes being from the same research group. Connor and Jasmine took the wholesaler perspective, more about what do we need to buy given a fixed budget from a big DoD picture. This talk is now going to focus more on the operational level. What do we need to forward deploy with the warfighters to support both peacetime and high op tempo operations? Okay. So, basically the way that DoD operates is the sustainment concepts to support the weapon systems that the DoD maintains relies on timely resupply from wholesale, right? And that makes sense. These weapon systems that the DoD operates, they're expensive, they're complicated. You might have, a big radar dome on a destroyer or a CVN that costs millions of dollars. And it's just impractical to buy a single radar for each hull that your program might manage. And so because of that, the sustainment system is designed so that the operators can rely on timely resupply from wholesale. Typically when you talk to programs, the system commands that manage the wholesale supply system, they're typically planning on resupplying the warfighter within 15 to 30 days in peacetime. And so in this concept of supporting the weapon system, you buy some set of expensive spares that you stock at CONUS, at your wholesale site in a big DLA, NAVSUP, Air Force Material Command warehouse. And then you buy a set of local spares, which we call retail, which you put on your ship, put next to your airplane. These are the items that are cheap, fail often, and insulate the warfighter or your weapon system against that transport delay of getting the material from a warehouse at CONUS to wherever you are operating. Of course, the challenge is that in a contested environment, you might anticipate that this sustainment system might be disrupted, right? So, and for the purposes of this talk today, when I say contested environment, I'm just saying the warfighter, the operational level, can no longer rely on timely resupply from the wholesale system, whether that's the DLA warehouse, a NAVSUP shipyard, or something like that. So in this talk today, we're going to explore some sparing strategies that we could adopt in the DoD and help decision makers make good risk-informed decisions to plan for a potential contested environment. So you might imagine the simplest and most straightforward approach to spare for a contested environment is say, I can accept no readiness risk for my operations. Therefore, I'm going to just spend a lot of money, dump a bunch of spares with my operators, with my combatant units, so that they can last a set amount of time at some confidence level, right? So say, maybe a given O plan says we want to last 50 days at 90% confidence. You can, look at your weapon system, calculate the set of spares that will support that operation, and, give the decision makers the desired budget. So typically in our experience when developing spares packages for these contested environments, decision maker says we can accept no readiness risk, go forth and do. You come back and give them the budget and they say, okay, maybe we can accept a little readiness risk. This is a very risk-averse and financially risky sparing strategy. And furthermore, when you have such a high level of readiness where each combatant unit has to operate in complete isolation for worst case scenario time, right? You're buying a lot of stuff that you're just going to never use, right? The radar might not fail very often, but to meet this particular desired level of readiness, you have to buy a copy of radar for each combatant unit. So I'm going to call this sparing strategy the single echelon, single unit endurance approach. Single echelon means we're just going to buy everything that we might need during our contested window and make sure that our unit can endure for that time frame. However, in reality, this is not how most combatant units in the DoD operate, right? Typically, you're not in complete isolation. You might operate in an environment, maybe a carrier strike group or something like that, right? So, alternative approach to try and, boost readiness levels to a level that's acceptable by senior leaders, but at lower cost, is to pre-position spares in theater. So you can think about this as like, we want to put some set of spares with our combatant units to support some operational tempo. But we also recognize that we can't afford, just realistically, to put a copy of the radar or the really expensive flux capacitor with each combatant unit. So what we'll do instead is we'll say, okay, we'll put as much as we can with our combatant units directly, but then plan an in-theater sustainment concept of operations where I have a set of pre-positioned spares such that even though the system is cut off because of the contested logistics environment, our combatant units can rely on periodic resupply from this set of pre-positioned spares. Think of like a mothership, maybe a supply ship, maybe a refueling ship, something like that. So the idea is that in both scenarios, we're planning for contested environment for X days. Just on the right, our combatant units have access to a set of pre-positioned spares for resupply every T days. We'll call this the resupply frequency. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some modeling and simulation techniques and optimization techniques that we've used to plan for both these scenarios and ensure that the readiness levels are comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And talk about some of the potential readiness and cost risks you take with each strategy. All right, so I apologize for the redundancy a bit, but I'm going to go and repeat myself a little bit for what you saw with Jasmine and Connor's talk. The DoD mandates that the services use readiness-based sparing. It's an optimization technique to decide what spares to buy. And in addition to just deciding what to buy, we're also going to be deciding where to put it. So we know that the washer fails, every 2 days. We should probably put lots of washers with our combatant units. We know that there's a small chance that the Nerf launcher for the destroyers fails. So we're going to put one copy of those in our pre-position site to insulate ourselves against that readiness risk we might incur. So, basically when you do RBS analyses, you are typically generating candidate stock postures of so-called optimal stock that maximizes your readiness, your operational availability, your mission capable rate, given fixed investments. And so typically when we do RBS analyses, we find something like this, where when you look at the stock posture that I have today and the readiness that I'm achieving today, you could potentially change what you're buying to save money but achieve the same levels of readiness, or spend the same amount of money but again change what I'm buying to increase readiness. And so the way that we do this in the Sustainment group is we use RBS to develop candidate sets of spares, and then we use discrete event simulations validated against historical readiness levels to predict what ASABO or MC, flight hours, steaming hours, whatever your level of metric of interest is, to tie those investment decisions to the anticipated readiness outcomes. So just to give you an idea of what we mean when we talk about discrete event simulations, you can think about like a big complicated board game where we assign probabilities to various things occurring. There's the Nerf launcher fails 5 times every 100 flight hours. And then what we do is we assign missions to the platform based on what the program says or how the program says it should operate. So this is an aviation example. You could imagine doing a similar setup for ground vehicles or aircraft. Pick your favorite weapon system of choice. So the idea is that we use RBS as an optimizer to come up with candidate sparing decisions, and then we evaluate the expected outcomes in the discrete event simulation to predict levels of readiness like A sub O or MC rate. And again, the key is that we use RBS to optimize, but if you want to tie those optimization decisions to outcomes, you need to simulate to make predictions. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our sustainment group workflow that has really enabled us to do these sophisticated analyses at scale. So typically we're either given or we develop in-house what we call ground truth model data. This is our best guess at what the true failure rate is of the radar. How long does it take to fix a flat tire? Things like that. This can either come from subject matter experts in the weapon system programs. Oftentimes we like to build our own ground truth from raw data. But what we've developed is we've developed an internal tool which we call Stinger, which lets us systematically and at scale turn ground truth data in a common format, either from the services or that we build in-house, into inputs to an RBS optimizer and a discrete event simulation tool. And so the nice thing about our tool that automatically builds out these discrete event simulations is we can quite simply provide what I call variation instructions to our ground truth model data to evaluate potentially hundreds or thousands of what-if scenarios. So for the purposes of the analysis I'm showing today, the way this works is we have our ground truth model data, that is the weapon system as we believe it to operate, and then we're applying the variation instructions, that is the anticipated op tempo and sustainment structure in a contested environment. So our tool Stinger converts the ground truth model data and our variation instructions into an RBS spares optimizer. There's a proprietary software suite that we use, but you could probably write up some R or Python code to do this quite quickly yourself. And I'm sure there are other software sets as well. Once we have our sets of candidate spares, we then again provide more variation instructions. Variation instructions being the different sustainment systems that we might anticipate in a contested environment. But now we also have, in addition to our ground truth model data, those sets of candidate spares given that particular sustainment system. And then with that, we can, in a matter of an hour, just kick off hundreds or thousands of what-if simulations where we evaluate the readiness outcomes for all of these different what-if scenarios. What-if scenarios being that single echelon endurance case where I just dump spares with my combatant unit, and then the multi-echelon endurance case where I have a set of prepositioned spares in theater, some spares that live with the combatant units themselves, and then I can evaluate the what-if scenarios for different sizes. What if my prepositioned spares supports 2 hulls? What if it supports 5 hulls? What if it supports 100 hulls or aircraft? And we can then evaluate those what-if scenarios at scale. All right, so what defines success for a single echelon combatant unit? That means where we just dump spares on my combatant unit. How do we define a successful mission? And so typically the DoD thinks about surviving a contested environment for some amount of days at some desired probability level. So when we just buy things and put it on a single combatant unit, we see that over time the probability of completing a mission for that amount of time, decays. And so you might say, my commander says that I want to last X days at some desired confidence level, and maybe that corresponds to where this dashed black line is right here. And then so what we do is we, for different sets of budgets, run these simulations over and over again to find the probability of lasting X days as a function of spares investment. And in particular, for this scenario here, it's the spares investment per combatant unit. And so you say, okay, here are all the different spares packages I have. My simulation predicts I can last X days at this probability. And then we have a nice cost versus effectiveness curve. And then, decision maker can say, all right, here's my risk profile as a function of investment. this is the amount of readiness risk I'm willing to take, we'll choose that spares package. And so the key thing is that we're trying to find the minimum investment that meets the DoD's readiness goals. In the quasi-multi-echelon, multiple combatant unit case, things are a bit more complicated. And the complication lets us achieve more optimal outcomes. So instead of just buying things and putting them on one ship or to support one forward operating base, we are now going to be buying spares and putting it at either the combatant units or in our pre-position site, mothership, forward position spares, in theater, whatever, however you can pre-position your spares best. And so, let's imagine that maybe I only have $10 to spend to support my fleet. It turns out that this circuit card A costs $10, so I can buy one circuit card A. I probably don't want to put it on any of the combatant units because I only have one, right? It's going to more efficiently support readiness by putting it at the forward position site. So for my first $10, I'm going to spend on that circuit card A and just stick it at my pre-position site. However, as I get more money to spend and buy more stuff, I can then, redistribute it from the forward position site to other halls. Maybe I now have $40, so I can buy 2 circuit card A's, put one at each of my combatant units, and then I also now have money to spend on a more expensive circuit card B and put this at my pre-position site. And so the idea here is that instead of buying combatant unit by combatant unit, we now spare together and have a more optimal outcome as we can best use our limited resources to support the entire fleet. So the trick here is that when you adopt such a sustainment strategy, you have to think carefully to make sure that how I define success for the single combatant unit translates in an appropriate manner to success for my multiple hull or multiple combatant unit scenario. Because, like I mentioned at the beginning, in this sustainment structure, your combatant units are relying on periodic resupply over the course of your mission set. So, in a simple example here, if you plot the probability of being mission capable on day X, you're going to get this oscillatory pattern, right? Because you're getting a new set of spares every 15 days. And so the probability of lasting X days no longer decays, and it's no longer a monotonically decaying function of mission length. And so the trick here is if you don't update that practical definition of endurance that we showed for the single unit case, you might trick yourself into saying, on day X I have a 90% probability of being operational. But that doesn't account for the fact that over the previous 2 weeks, you were going down and coming back up as you relied on resupply from the prepositioned spares in theater. So the metric that we took the senior leader's desired level of risk, lasting X days without resupply, we converted that to mission time accumulated over the course of the mission set in contested logistics. So you might think of this as flight hours accomplished for an aviation context, steaming hours accomplished for ships, or pick whatever metric best describes your mission set for the particular weapon system. And so now by ensuring that in our quasi-multi-echelon scenario, where we have multiple combatant units, we're ensuring that on average we're achieving the same number of mission hours as we did in the single echelon scenario that meets senior leaders' risk tolerance for readiness. We can now ensure that we're not inadvertently introducing unwanted readiness risk to the fleet by adopting this prepositioned spares approach to sustainment. So I have 2 examples here where the red curve shows the relative mission time accomplished for that single unit endurance scenario, and the gray shows the mission time accomplished per combatant unit when you are supported by a set of prepositioned spares. And so as you might anticipate, that efficiency of having some centralized stock really, we'll see in the next slide, gives you a financial benefit while not accepting any reduced readiness risk. And so this chart here is a notional example for the results that we've seen over multiple weapon systems over the course of this project. And that is that as you increase the number of units that your prepositioned spares support, you see a decreased cost without a readiness loss. And typically it's depending on how many units you're supporting. It's common to see to save 50 cents on the dollar by adopting this prepositioning strategy. And fundamentally, I think this makes sense. There are complicated weapon systems. There are black swan events. There's always a small probability of something very bad happening. And by having this set of prepositioned spares, you can insulate yourself against those black swan events that could disrupt your readiness objectives. And again, you could insulate yourself against these black swans combatant unit by combatant unit, but by nature that's just very, very expensive, and oftentimes the programs we work with don't have the budgets to do that. So if you'll sometime when we get from programs the question, oh, this is a cool concept, but how is this different from just lowering my endurance scenario from X days to X divided by 2, right? Yeah. And the answer to that is that is fundamentally different, at least if you're comparing apples to apples. So what I have here is an example that shows the relative mission time accomplished in X days. The left two columns are single echelon X day endurance. By definition, that's the reference. So 1. In the quasi-multi-echelon case, I already demonstrated that we can achieve the same readiness levels. So again, by definition, that's also 1 here too. But then if you just say, all right, I'm going to lower my single unit endurance, maybe because it's easier to think through and spare unit by unit, and support myself from like a pack-up kit in theater. And if you take that approach in that third column with a finite set of spares, you just don't meet the same readiness objectives. It's like, what's the probability of flipping tails for, it's 50-50 for 1, but if you do it multiple times, flipping tails each time goes down, right? So just taking this siloed unit by unit approach means you inevitably take on some readiness risk in doing so. And furthermore, this effect is so important that even if you say, all right, I'm going to take my, X day endurance, I'm going to lower the threshold and say maybe I have an infinite set of prepositioned spares to support my units. Even in that case, you'll never achieve that high readiness risk threshold that leaders set out at the beginning because you're not making these sparing decisions together. All right, so the take-home message is that I've just showed one example for one value of X and T, but there is in reality going to be a trade space between single unit endurance and cost savings to the fleet. Because this approach does not come without risk. Prepositioning spares provides a single point of failure, right? That might mean that if that periodic resupply to your combatant units is disrupted, you are taking more risk in that sense. And so, but again, the nice thing is that once we have defined our ground truth for a weapon system and we have our automation tools, we can fully explore this trade space as senior leaders come up with new ideas to support the fleet in a contested environment. All right, so in conclusion, we've showed today that you can use RBS and discrete event simulations to ensure that your weapon system is meeting high readiness goals in contested environment. We showed that this idea of pre-positioning spares is cost effective, but it does bring with it some risk, right? It means that combatant units rely on that timely resupply to meet the readiness goals. And then, in future work, what things we'd like to do, we'd like to explore how the cost savings and readiness might change as assumptions in our models break down. So didn't talk about it in detail, but the software we use for these discrete event simulations assumes exponential failure rates. What happens if our failure rates are not exponential? We have some preliminary evidence to show that prepositioning might be more important to meet those readiness goals? Or would you relax that exponential assumption? And we also want to explore in more gory detail the full trade space between readiness and financial risk. And that is all that I have. So I'm happy to take any questions folks might have.
Hey, good talk. So I think this is a two-part question. So in the real world, never enough spares, right? Yeah. And you see a lot of robbing from Peter to pay Paul, right? So rather than looking to the depot and pulling out the spare, it's actively going to another unit that's already mission incapable and pulling whatever you can off of there. Is that a function that needs to be modeled because it happens all the time, or what do you think?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we call that cannibalization in our group. I don't know if other folks use that same language. So it's kind of a philosophy, right? In my opinion, it's something that should be modeled in evaluating readiness if it happens, if you're trying to most closely mimic the real world. So in our models, depending on the platform, we do include it if possible. For the one I showed today, I did not include it because sometimes when you're trying to plan, programs don't like to plan for that, which I get. Because there are costs associated with cannibalization that we can't model effectively, at least, like manpower, headaches, right, leadership visibility. So typically, in my experience, programs don't like to plan for that. So when we are suggesting sparing decisions, we typically don't include it. But when we're, evaluating real-world health of the fleet, we typically do include cannibalization. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
So second question is, the other thing I see a lot of is when we're buying a new unit, for instance, a new DDG, and they say, we're going to replace System X with System Y. It has slightly different sparing. And because of that, you end up with these boutique systems where you need a specific spare for this specific unit. Is there a way to use this model to justify commonality among systems, so you can model out the effects of having a difference in the systems? You may save $10 million up front, but because of the logistics train, you're going to end up spending $50 million over the next 10 years.
Yep, that's a fantastic question, and I think this setup would be perfect to do that. We have not done that, but that's a good idea, and I might steal that idea and do it sometime. Because the cost savings and readiness risks you incur will break down as your weapon systems become more heterogeneous, right? And the limit that they have no overlapping parts from ship to ship or plane to plane, then just do the single hull case. So I think you could do some what-if analysis to show the anticipated costs by, bespoke hull-by-hull or plane-by-plane configurations. Yeah, great question.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Curtis Miller from IDA. I don't have a two-part question. I have two questions.
Okay.
So, okay, fine. Anyway, first question. So it sounds like what's happening is you have a mathematical model for readiness-based sparing. You use that model to develop strategies for allocating spare parts that then are evaluated using your discrete event simulation.
Yep.
So one thing I'm wondering is, why not use statistical optimization techniques on the DES itself to see what it says about where things should be put, or at the very least, compare the two to each other?
Yep, great question. So that's something we are working on right now. The cop-out answer is the DoD requires RBS in evaluating with discrete event simulation.
Great.
So that's what we do, but we are evaluating. We have a new suite of tools that essentially uses an evolutionary algorithm from the discrete event simulation itself. And I think you will see further, potentially much greater, some preliminary evidence that potentially much greater efficiencies gained when you do that. Yeah.
All right, so my second question is, and this kind of relates to the previous talk as well, where I think it was Russ Kupfer was asking about, what about during wartime, which there is an author, wargamer and statistician, Peter Perla, who talked about the cycle of research, where you have wargaming, which is producing con-ops and where there's humans in the loop. They're producing stories or situations that then get fed into M&S that are then also used to like see what numerically what might happen, and also like where these two things are feeding into each other. I could see a situation where you do a whole bunch of mathematical modeling and such. You bring it into a war game. The red player looks at the output of that model and says to the big grin on his face, "I can't wait to blow that up," right? So, like, is there any sort of activity that's looking to have, and also there's these other models that are like the campaign models that are more attrition based that will also certainly be affecting your demand curves, you could say. So is there any sort of looking at this integration of like human in the loop wargaming for producing in con-ops and also just looking for problems that are not in the math models, and then like maybe the campaign models for like getting a sense of what attrition might actually more realistically look like, and also your sparing models that are then like taking that in and using that to determine where, you know, when red's acting and when attrition's happening, where should we be putting our stuff?
Yep, that's a great question. So the short answer is that's something that we're looking into in the future. Have some ongoing projects that are, you know, providing synergy between the wargaming qualitative folks and our modeling simulation techniques. But as of right now, it's just more of like a proof of principle concept study to show that there might be efficiency gains. Right. I think, yeah, if you wanted to actually implement this, that would definitely be necessary to involve the wargaming side of the house to make the best decisions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's thank our speaker.